Well, hello everyone and welcome to the Australian Institute of Architects Climate Action Forum, Architects' Plan for a Zero Carbon Built Environment. We're bringing you this forum today from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I'd like to begin by paying respect to elders and community as continuing custodians of their rich cultural heritage. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners and custodians of lands across Australia. Well, today's forum is an initiative of the Institute's Climate Action and Sustainability Taskforce, or CAST, chaired by Professor Helen Lochhead. We'll start with 3 presentations from Edward Mazria, founder and CEO of Architecture 2030, Ross Donaldson, academic, urbanist and architect, and Scientia Professor Prasad from UNSW, covering the international context, the local, and then practical grassroots action. That'll be followed by a live conversation between the keynote presenters and Helen Lochhead. From there, Helen will move on to chairing the next live panel discussion with Chris Bowen, Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Zali Steggall, Independent Member for Warringah, and Senator Mehreen Faruqi, Australian Greens spokesperson for Housing. They'll be joined by Vincent Martinez, the President and COO of Architecture 2030, joining us live from the US, and Caroline Pidcock from Architects Declare. And of course, you, the audience, are very much part of the discussion today. The Institute is asking you 3 questions to feed into their research. The first question, are you able to deliver net zero buildings by 2030? Secondly, what can the Institute do to help you deliver net zero carbon buildings? And finally, are you interested in participating in Institute activities on delivering net zero buildings? To respond, go to the Slido link on screen and enter the code #ClimateActionForum. We'll be bringing those details up on screen over the next hour or so and looking at the responses as they come through. So our aim is to report back on some of the results at the end of the forum today. And now, to give us a sense of CAST's work to date and what today is all about, I am joined by Professor Helen Lochhead, the CAST Chair. Helen, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, Viv. Thanks for having me.
Well, humanity's code red kind of says it all, doesn't it, really? But would you say that today's forum is one of the most important conversations the Australian Institute of Architects has hosted?
Yes, it is. I think with the release of the IPCC report in August, it was widely conceded that the climate crisis has escalated. It's an emergency that can no longer be ignored, and I think Code Red says it all. How we as a profession respond is absolutely critical. And with the built environment accounting for almost 40% of all carbon emissions globally, architects have a pivotal role to play in the race to net zero. And more importantly, we have a responsibility to engage in this challenge and find solutions that make a positive difference. So we need to act, and we need to act now. So it's important that we come together today to share the progress of the Climate Action and Sustainability Taskforce and hear what others are doing internationally and map out a plan of action. The timing of this forum is opportune, I think, in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow, as the world will focus on what we can do to address this crisis. And in Australia, with the federal election looming, there is an opportunity to engage with our political leaders to show real leadership in this arena with our support.
And Helen, I know that CAST has been making progress on multiple fronts. Can you give us a sense of the work that's been done to date?
Yes, of course. During my term as National President of the Institute of Architects, we joined with Architects Declare and made a commitment to become a carbon zero organisation. We undertook an audit of our operations and replaced unnecessary travel in 2019 with virtual meetings, well ahead of the pandemic, I have to say. And within just 12 months, we reduced our carbon footprint by 50%. And with green power and carbon offsets, we've now achieved our zero carbon goal. Carbon neutral certification, yay. And so we invite all our members to transition to carbon zero ASAP if they haven't already done so. We can do it and you can too. But in tandem, we established the Climate Action and Sustainability Taskforce, or CAST, to develop a comprehensive strategy. And responding to a national call, we put together an extraordinary lineup of committed professionals from practice, universities, and government. And in addition to Ross, Deo, and Caroline, who are cast members and who'll be here today with me, there's Jeremy McLeod, Liz Brogden, Stephen Bruce, Peter Sullivan, plus CEO Julia Kambesh, and Leanne and Linda from the Institute team, who've all made an incredible contribution to our progress to date. We made decarbonising the construction industry by 2030 our focus. And we've developed a plan adopted by the National Council in 2020, and Ross will elaborate on this. But in brief, we identified 3 priorities: education and research, with the goal of prepared graduates, informed professionals, and educated clients. And our first step was contributing to the new national standards for competency for architects, and Ross will talk more about this too. The second was tools and benchmarks to identify best practice to assist our members. And my UNSW colleague, Deo Prasad, and his team completed an audit of a vast array of relevant tools and have developed a guide with tangible steps to help designers to get to net zero, and he'll talk about that. And our next task is to work on a new Australian standard for zero carbon buildings. Our third agenda item was policy and advocacy, to map out what government, suppliers, and architects need to do respectively. We've developed a draft design excellence policy framed around the UN sustainability goals that puts environmentally sustainable practice front and centre. And embedded in both the new AACA standards and the design policy is the recognition that designing with country is a fundamental prerequisite to environmentally and culturally sustainable practice. And we're also currently working with ASPEC and others to ensure an updated national construction code strengthens standards for energy efficiency. We're partnering with suppliers on low carbon products, and we've also contributed to the RIBA and Architects Declared book for the built environment submission to COP26. So we've been busy, very busy.
You certainly have, Helen. And I guess now moving on to today and what it's all about, what are the objectives? Where do you hope these discussions will lead?
Well, look, I really want to position architects as leaders in a low carbon future. And to do this, we need to lead by example. And that's starting now. Many architects are already ahead of the curve, but we can do so much more collectively. And we want all architects and our colleagues across the sector to come on the journey. Architects' commitment to go carbon neutral in their practice and projects is first up, and we can help you get there. So check out our website today and see the steps you need to take.
Wonderful. Well, that's certainly a great scene setter for the day, Helen. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'll let you go now, and we will catch up once again at the conclusion of the forum.
See you then.
And now to the first presentation, an international situational analysis from Edward Mazria. Edward is the founder and CEO of Architecture 2030, a think tank developing real-world solutions for 21st century problems. He is an internationally recognised architect, author, researcher and educator. Over the past decade, his seminal research into the sustainability, resilience, energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions of the built environment has redefined the role of architecture, planning, design and building in reshaping our world.
Hello, I'm Edward Mazria, CEO of Architecture 2030. It's great to be with you today. We have quite a bit to discuss and a lot of issues to go over. So let's begin. In 2007, we held a global emergency teach-in, and at the teach-in, I was sitting next to Dr. James Hansen. He was one of the presenters at our teach-in, and I asked him at that time, when will we see the effects of climate change? So this was quite some time ago. He said when the world and the planet reaches 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So I checked on the NASA website where we are today. We're right at 1.02 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And right on cue, the world is experiencing all sorts of climate impacts right now, and no country is spared. And it'll only get worse if we keep putting CO2 into the atmosphere. Well, in December 2015, the world gathered in Paris and agreed to try to keep planetary global warming temperatures above pre-industrial levels, limited to 1.5 degrees C or thereabouts. The countries will gather now in Scotland in a few weeks to actually increase their ambition so we could meet that 1.5. But right now, no country is meeting the 1.5. Everyone is emitting more than they should be at this particular point in time, and their pledges to reduce emissions don't go near far enough. So we know what the issue is. The issue is putting CO2 into the atmosphere, burning fossil fuels. Right now, we're putting about 40 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. We hear all sorts of countries and cities and governments and industries saying, well, we're going to phase out our emissions by 2050. Well, we've wasted 5-6 years already. And phasing out CO2 emissions by 2030, peaking now and by 2050, and phasing out emissions by 2050 is 600 gigatons of CO2. That's less than a 50% probability of staying under the 1.5 or meeting the 1.5. That's terrible odds. So we see governments and industries increasing their ambition and calling for a 50% reduction by 2030 and then phasing out by 2050. Well, that's better. It gives us a 50-50 probability of meeting the 1.5, but given what we see at 1 degree, that's not very good odds. So what do we really need to do? Well, we need to peak emissions in 2020, and we need to phase out all CO2 emissions by 2040, reach a 50% reduction by 2030. If we do that, 50% by 2030, 0 by 2040, we have a 67% chance, a good probability then, at least, of staying under and meeting the 1.5 degrees C target that was agreed upon in Paris by all the countries. And if we want to do even better, we think our sector can do better. Our sector should meet a 65% reduction by 2030 and then phase out all CO2 emissions by 2040. We can do that in the built environment. So how difficult is it to do that? Well, we're calling on all architects, planners, engineers, building sector professionals, industries associated with the building sector and the built environment to design to zero carbon now, not wait. These are the 3 steps that we can take to get to zero carbon. Step 1, design to the latest code standards or better. We have great codes out there. No matter what code your city or state or country has in place, if it's not up to the latest code standards, it doesn't prevent you from designing to the latest code standards. The code only sets a minimum standard, so you can design to the latest code standard. We'll go over that in a minute. 2, no on-site fossil fuels, design all electrical, and then use renewables for that electricity. And then 3, zero out embodied carbon, specify materials for your building and construction that don't emit carbon. So those are the 3 steps. Let's get at each one and look at them individually. First, design to the latest code standards or better. Well, this was back in 2000. This is 2003. This is what buildings were using at that time. So this is a 100,000 square foot office building in 4 different climate zones around the world in the US. And if you design to Western standards, Western code standards, this is roughly what your building energy consumption would be at that point. This is where the latest code standards take us. Again, 100,000 square foot office building. You can see that the code standards are so efficient now, the latest ones, that we reduce our energy consumption and our emissions in most building types anywhere from 50 to 60, 70%, or even some cases 80%, if we're using the latest code standards. So this is ASHRAE 90.1 2019, designing to that code standard in the 2021 IECC. And you can see that half of the load in new buildings now is the plug load. The actual code doesn't really get you much in the plug load, but reduces the energy consumption of the building as a whole, the heating, the lighting, the cooling. And you can see that's in the blue bar. There's not much left. We've squeezed as much out of those buildings roughly as we're going to get. We can get 3, 4, 5% more efficient every few years, but that's going to be about it. So we're down. Our codes are really pretty good. So first thing we need to do, design energy efficient building. Use the IECC 2021, ASHRAE 90.1, or any code standard that gives you an efficient building. And then you can design beyond that. Design a better envelope, use daylighting strategies, passive heating, cooling, and ventilating, efficient systems and controls. You can get way, way down where a building's energy consumption is very, very small, and most of it then will be just the plug load. So one was design to the latest code standards or highly efficient buildings. 2, design all electric, no on-site fossil fuels, and then produce that electricity with renewables. So how do we do that? 1, we design all electric, and then we address the remaining building's energy needs with on-site. And if we can do it, renewables on-site, then we're done. Or we do some on-site if we can, and then purchase or procure the rest with off-site new renewable energy, wind, solar, hydro, you name it. That gets us to zero carbon. And we know, for example, that the city of Sydney is introducing a net zero emission standard, like a zero code, similar to Architecture 2030 zero code, calling for highly efficient buildings by 2023 and achieving net zero output by 2026, meaning that they're achieved through energy efficiency and then site energy generation and offsite renewable energy purchases. And the the Climate Action Sustainability Taskforce that was put together proposes that the Australian Institute of Architects commits to a target to decarbonize the entire construction industry by the year 2030. That would be great, and we can do that within our industry with or without government help. Better, obviously, with government help, but we can design to zero carbon standards now. Well, what about all those existing buildings? That's for new buildings we just talked about. It's the same formula: efficiency, upgrade them for efficiency when you can, electrify them, get rid of the on-site fossil fuels, and then use on-site or off-site renewables to power the building. And we've discovered something really interesting. This is an aerial view of New York City. You can see those red circles. That's where all the huge buildings, the skyscrapers that we see, the skyline of New York, that's where it is. It's in Midtown, downtown Manhattan, and in downtown Brooklyn. That's where all the very big buildings are. That's less than 2% of the total buildings in New York City. There's over 1 million buildings in New York, and that's only about 20,000 of them. That small number of buildings is responsible for 48% of all the building emissions in New York City. So a very few buildings are responsible for a huge portion of emissions, and then all the other million buildings are responsible for the rest. We can see that same scenario in almost every city worldwide. This is Chicago, for example, all the big buildings, downtown Chicago along the waterfront, and then miles and miles of small buildings. Same thing in Philadelphia. Same thing in Los Angeles. Same thing in Sydney, Australia, downtown. Huge buildings, and then miles and miles of small buildings. Thousands of small buildings. Same thing in Guangzhou and in Turkey. Big buildings in the downtown area, and then miles of smaller buildings. You can see the same thing in Japan and Nagasaki along the waterfront, or Long Beach, and then behind it, miles and miles of small buildings. So those large buildings are responsible for, almost half of all the building sector's emissions, and then the rest are all these many, many, many small buildings. So we can develop a policy. We can say, hey, if you have a big building that's responsible for roughly almost half the emissions, it's not only going to be a handful of buildings, you get to zero carbon by 2030, and we'll provide some incentives for you to do that. But if you don't, then there's a penalty. Give them low interest loans, tax abatements, all sorts of things that you can do. And then what about those thousands and millions of other small buildings? You require them to get to zero carbon by 2035 or 2040, and you use intervention points. Small buildings are sold all the time. At point of sale, the new owner coming in has financing, is usually going to renovate. Then he renovates, gets rid of the on-site fossil fuels, uses renewables, and he's at zero carbon. Require them to go to zero carbon when they're going to renovate, get a zoning or use change, equipment replacement, any intervention point where they're going to do some construction, you get them to zero. You'll get most of the buildings. Okay, so we looked at new buildings, we looked at existing buildings. Now, what about all of that construction that goes on every year to build out buildings and the infrastructure in buildings? Well, it's been a problem, and we're just now beginning to address it. There are literally hundreds of thousands of choices out there for materials. Wood, steel, concrete, brick, flooring, carpet, vinyl, glass, light fixture, you name it. There are thousands and thousands of products to choose from. How do we get all these products to zero carbon? Well, this is usually the way we see global emissions divvied up. Building operations, which we just talked about, is 28% of all emissions. Then industry is really the belly of the beast. That's 43%. That's all the infrastructure, buildings, substructure, equipment, system. That's agriculture. That's your computer. That's your sunglasses. That's literally everything that's made goes into industry. And then transportation is 23%. So how do we get a handle on industry? All those different products and materials. Well, we discovered something interesting. Two materials, concrete and steel, were responsible for almost half of all industrial emissions. If you throw in aluminum into that, then you get over it. But really, concrete and steel are the big two. So it's almost like big buildings, small buildings. A very small percentage of buildings are responsible for almost half of all emissions. And then you have many, many, many small buildings. The same thing with products. Many, 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 many products, but concrete and steel responsible for almost 50%. So you have to create a two-tier system again to address the industrial sector. And we can see it in building the embodied carbon when we actually build a building. If we're building a large building, almost 2/3, almost 3/4 or the embodied carbon is in the structure, is in the concrete and steel of the structure of the building. And then the rest, the envelope and glass and carpet and everything else, interior walls, are the rest, interiors. And even in a medium structure, we're over 50%. If we get down to a light wood structure, we're roughly 40 to 50% is in the structure. So the structure is the first thing we want to get at, and that's very few materials. Obviously, going to wood is a lot better. Now, if we can save a building and not tear it down and build a new one, then we're over on the right side, and we're just dealing with renovation and no structure. We save all the structure, so we have a huge savings every time we save a building and renovate it rather than building new. So that's the first option, and then we go to different materials. So now what do? We know the two materials, concrete and steel, and then all the rest. How do we get a handle on all this? Well, the first thing we need to do is change the conversation. And we're now beginning to see that in mainstream media. Concrete, the most destructive material on Earth. You can't do anything unless everyone knows about it. And we're beginning to see that. Steel makers next in the crosshairs as climate pressure grows. And as we see the impacts of climate change, we're going to see huge pressure on those two industries. And the good news is there's competition. They now have competition, and glue laminated and heavy timber, cross laminated timber is giving concrete and steel a bit of heartburn because it's taking market share away. And if it's done sustainably, from sustainably managed bars, then it can even be a drawdown material. So now what can we in our industry do? What can we as architects and planners and designers, what can we do? Well, there's three things we can look at. We can reuse, we can reduce, and we can sequester. So let's look at reuse first. Well, obviously the greenest building in development or neighborhood is one that is already built. So we want to repurpose and upgrade urban areas and renovate existing buildings and use local and recycled materials. When we do that, we save a huge amount of infrastructure and materials if we do that. And if we're designing new buildings, we can design them to actually be deconstructed after their useful life so that we can reuse the materials. Then we can reduce. Well, if we establish growth boundaries and don't keep suburbanizing, we obviously begin to save on infrastructure. We can infill and densify. We know that density is not a COVID spreader, by the way. So we can infill and use all the infrastructure that's in place. That saves us a huge amount of embodied carbon. So infill is another strategy we can use. We can optimize structure. Right now, we over-structure everything. If we optimize structure, we use less materials. We can specify low to zero carbon materials. We're calling for a 40% reduction now. There are tools available that we can look at to actually analyze different life cycle assessments from material manufacturers within the same category and specify the one who has the lowest embodied carbon. And we're beginning now to see public policy address that issue. Then the third thing we can do is actually sequester carbon in materials by using sustainable and glue laminated wood. We're starting to see sustainable and glue laminated bamboo beginning to be investigated. There's one company now that's actually producing structural members in the global south. So wood, mass timber, comes from the global north. We hope that bamboo then takes off in the global south because it's very fast growing. It can be harvested very quickly. It's a grass, and it'll take in a lot of carbon. We're now looking at carbon positive aggregate. We have a company actually making it now and expanding, where they're actually taking CO2 and making aggregate out of it and turning it into aggregate for concrete. We're looking at injecting CO2 into concrete and changing its properties, strengthening it, shortening the time it cures. There's all sorts of benefits to doing that. And we're seeing now companies sprout up all across the country and around the world that do this. And now we're looking at full cycle plants where we take the CO2 from making the cement and then taking that and injecting it into the concrete. So it's a zero carbon material. Using biomaterials that actually embody carbon and then encapsulating that in buildings. And if we use renewable energy to actually make those biomaterials, then they become actually carbon sequestering materials. And landscape and soil and urban agriculture, in bringing urban agriculture into cities, so we reduce the transportation costs and using landscapes to actually draw down CO2. So there's all sorts of strategies that we can use. So can we meet the 1.5 degrees C? Can we meet that carbon budget, 50 to 65% by 2030, and phase out all CO2 emissions by 2040? Well, let's take a look at history and see what have we done in the past. Well, this is Toronto in 1891. You can see the Flatiron building right under that 1891, that building with the little tower. Keep your eye on that. But these buildings were masonry buildings, very small spans, 3 or 4 stories high, walk-ups. This is what it was like in 1891. Electricity first just came in at that time. This is Toronto, roughly Toronto today. So how did that change take place? Look at these huge buildings behind the Flatiron building with big horizontal windows, no more bearing walls. These are essentially curtain walls hung off the structure. How did this all take place? Well, the first modern building was in 1925. This is considered the first modern building, where structure moved inside the building, no more bearing walls. So you had point loads with columns and beams. You opened up the floor plan. You can see it went from wall to wall, from one side of the building to the other. And then you hung the building off the structure. You can make it all glass, big horizontal windows, connect to the outside. Incredible. So we use reinforced concrete here. When steel came along, we were using steel. So this is considered the first modern building. That was 1925. So what was going on in 1925? Well, it's pretty primitive. We didn't even have television. The first Model T truck came in, and we didn't make the first transatlantic call till 1927. So things were pretty primitive back then. In 1928, conditions were so bad in Europe that the architects and planners, the most influential architects and planners, got together and held the first International Congress of Modern Architecture. And they set up a whole set of guidelines. Get the housing out of these industrial areas. People were dying at very early age, emphysema and lung conditions. There was soot everywhere. Conditions were really terrible. They called for function-based zones. That's zoning today. They called for high-rise housing blocks with lots of sunlight and exposure to sunlight. Put them in parks, rather than in these polluted areas. Solar exposure so that you got heat and light free, free heating, for example, in Northern Europe. And they called for free, efficient circulation. And they laid out, so those were the planning principles, and they laid out the architecture principles, Le Corbusier's 5 points. Column wall separation, so you freed up the design of the facade. Now you can have lots of glass, horizontal windows, inside out connection, freed up the design of the plan. You can put the walls anywhere. And it was interesting. They call for any land that you took up on the ground plane is put it back on the roof. We're starting to see that happen now. Didn't take off then. But those were the guidelines that were set out to change the world. That was in 1928. By 1932, in the US, we called it an international style. We could take the principles from the modern movement in Europe and apply them in the US. We can apply them anywhere in the world. Because why? We can condition that interior space now. Energy was so cheap. So what was going on in 1932? Well, we didn't even have a commercial airport in the US at that time. That didn't happen until 1935. By 1939, we had the beautiful Johnson Wax building with point loads, for example, columns, and big open floor space, huge. So that was 39. By 1949, you had the glass house by Philip Johnson. That's a single glass, all glass house, metal and glass in New Canaan, Connecticut, which is a cold northern climate. By 52, you had the beautiful Lever House, which was again a single glass building hung off the structure. We could climate control anything. And by 56, you had Brasilia, an entire city was planned on the modern principles. So how long did that transition take? Well, from 1925, from the Bauhaus to the Lever House, 1952, was 27 years. We changed the world in 27 years using these design tools. We didn't have an ink pen. We had two prongs that we dipped in an inkwell, and then did our drawings with a T-square, and triangle ink would get under the T-square. We didn't have erasers. We had a razor blade, and we'd scrape off the ink. It would take a year, 2 years to do a set of construction documents. We couldn't do a curve. You couldn't use a curve because you actually couldn't build it, because you couldn't dimension it in the construction document. We didn't have computers back then. We had slide rules. We changed the world in 27 years with these fairly primitive by today's standard design tools. We didn't even get an ink pen until 1960, and we didn't have the first laptop until 1991. So think what we did in 27 years, and think what we have now. We have the 2030 palette, for example, at 2030palette.org. It has all the strategies that you need, the rules of thumb and the guidelines for developing zero carbon and even carbon positive and sustainable built environment, and dealing with some of the impacts. This is going to be, again, this is upgraded every year and will be upgraded heavily this year now that we know what many of the impacts are. You have all these tools that are out there, simulation tools, structural tools, daylighting tools. We can look at everything. You have EC3, which is looking at different materials and giving the embodied carbon of many, many different companies so that you can select the lowest one. You have solar skyrise. We can look at entire cities. We have incredible tools now to design to very, very low carbon or zero carbon standards. And now solar. This was last year in October. Solar became the cheapest electricity in history, confirmed by the International Energy Agency. So renewables now are much cheaper than fossil fuels. So do we have any examples out there of going to zero carbon? And how far have we gotten from 2005? Well, this is the United States building sector. This is the entire building sector, every building in the United States. This was in 2005, and I'm going to now forward it to 2020 and see what the emissions are. Even though between 2005 and 2020, we've added about 60 billion square feet to our building sector. A huge amount of building has been done in that period, and the building sector has grown. But look at greenhouse gas emissions. In the US building sector, we're down 30% from 2005 levels, and that's today. That's actually in 2020, last year. And how did we do that? Because every time we keep adding buildings, we keep using more energy, and emissions have been going up. That has been historical from the Industrial Revolution until 2005. Every time we built a building, energy consumption in the sector went up and emissions went up. In 2005, somehow that all changed. Well, we discovered that the building sector was largely responsible for a lot of climate change, a lot of the issues, and a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And we alerted the entire global building sector with that information. And we asked the building sector to begin to design differently and they responded. And so now we're down 30% from 2005 levels. The administration wants to have a fully clean grid by 2035 and provide other incentives for building electrification, adopting better codes and all that. If they make good on the 2035 clean grid by 2035 and put in place a few other things, we should be in the US down 72% from 2005 levels in our emissions and easily phase out all CO2 emissions in the building sector, in the entire building sector in the US by the year 2040. And we're asking all countries to increase their ambition to 50 to 65% by 2030, zero by 2040 in the upcoming COP that's taking place in the UK in Glasgow in a few weeks. We're asking them to commit to these reduction targets, and we will show them the way. We know how to do this in the built environment. It's the largest energy and emissions sector in the world, and we're committed to doing this. And we're asking the countries to commit also. We will have a communique that will deliver to the conference. And that communique is signed by over 60 of the largest architecture and planning firms in the world, and most of the professional organizations, including the American Institute of Architects, the International Union of Architects, the UIA, and the Australian Institute of Architects, along with many, many others. And many are signing on as we speak. So this list is only going to grow. We're looking for the largest firms and those responsible for billions and billions of dollars worth of construction committed to meeting these targets. So with that, we'll finish up, and I want to thank you very much, and we'll go to the rest of the program now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. And now to put Ed's presentation into an Australian context, our next speaker is Ross Donaldson from CAST. A former CEO and chairman of Woods Bagot, where he led the practice to dramatic international growth, Ross is a champion of the imperative for sustainable development, and he's presented numerous lectures throughout Australia, China, the UK and the United States on sustainable models for cities and their livability.
Well, my job today is to talk about the work of the CAST Committee, the Institute of Architects CAST Committee, and the work we've been doing helping the Institute formulate its policy with regard to climate change and climate change targets. And one of the interesting things about the working of this committee is that we've never met each other. Well, some of the folks have met each other, but I've actually never met anybody that I've been working with on this committee, because it's all been done in the time of COVID, and we started around about the first lockdown. So that's an interesting reflection for me on how you can work together with people you've never met before. And I will begin today by a bit of backgrounding on the climate emergency. I don't think any discussion about the climate emergency should begin without restating some of the basis of the urgency, even though I'm sure everybody in this room is committed to that understanding. You never know, there might just be someone in the room out there who hasn't quite got it yet, and we have to keep reinforcing the message. So like everybody, I will start with some of that story if you'll allow me. So let's get started. So yes, the decarbonising of the Australian construction industry by 2030 is the topic that I'm talking about. The Institute of Architects work in this regard. So as I touched on, the AIA established the Climate Action and Sustainability Taskforce, CAST, to bring focus and momentum to the climate emergency. And we have to thank Helen Lochhead for showing the way and initiating this and being the spearhead of it. So thanks for getting us started, Helen. And in October of last year, we presented the report that I'm speaking to today to the National Council, titled the Coordinated Climate Action Plan, CCAP, which I think may not be a unique title, but anyway, that's the one we're still working with. And the focus, of course, was to say that we really should be decarbonising the construction industry in this country by 2030. No more talk about 2050 and so forth. We've got to elevate our trajectory, and I'm going to be talking today about how we can get away with that, how we can do that. And I'll include some material that talks to some degree about the pathway of the actions. Not too much detail, but a little bit of a sense that we've really developed a plan. It's not just a high-level aspiration. So the urgency, of course, has most recently been very significantly highlighted by the 6th assessment report of the IPCC that was brought out a few weeks ago. It's a substantial document. I'm not too sure how many people will have read it, but it really does make the point again, and goes under a kind of banner of Code Red for Humanity. So I'm not sure how much more you could say to sort of get the attention on the topic and the subject. And the material that's contained within there relates quite strongly to one of my favourite sources of information around the science, and that's the Potsdam Institute, and the terrific work of people like Will Steffen, who's at ANU in this country, and Johan Rockström in Europe. And therein we see stories about the Earth as warming 170 times faster than it has for 7,000 years. And we're approaching that 2-degree tipping point. Of course, we now talk about 1.5, and part of the reason for that is that 2 degrees might be too high and too late. It might actually be a tipping point where the Earth tips from a self-cooling to a self-heating system, and then who knows what will happen after that. And it's important to realise that the temperature's never been above pre-industrial periods by 2 degrees in the last 3 million years. That's a mind-blowing statistic for me. And once we get into the higher numbers, in the 4 to 8 degrees, if we don't take our action, then we could be producing sea level rises between 10 and 60 metres if the Antarctic and Greenland ice caps melt. Now, that's an extreme scenario, and let's hope we go nowhere near that. So this is the kind of key graph, isn't it? This shows a range of trajectories depending on what actions we take. From taking no action at the top, producing very high CO2 emissions that will take us into that territory of potential risk of 5 degrees temperature increase, to the blue line, which shows if we really do get rapidly onto it, there's actually a potential to lower some of the temperature increases we've been experiencing. And this is the graph that was also produced by the Potsdam Institute after the previous report, which shows the kind of sea rise increases we could experience in those extreme cases, even in this century, 2 metres sea rise, if we stay on that extreme trajectory. And that's really not worth contemplating, although we shouldn't forget it. So climate change and biodiversity loss is the most urgent problem of our time, and our built environment accounts for nearly 40% of that. So we've got plenty we can contribute as people in the building industry and architects practicing the design of buildings. So climate change is a result of breakdowns in the carbon cycle caused by us. It's a design failure. It's a design failure. And I think that's what we as the architectural profession really need to own responsibility for that. And we believe the work of CAST and the way we formulated this story is that we have to approach, if we want to succeed with that aspiration of 2030, we have to approach it on a campaign basis. We have to formulate a campaign to actually define a pathway to get there. We can't just describe aspirations for points of arrival and targets. We need a pathway. We need a plan. So we've approached it on the basis that architects often work with project plans to ensure buildings get delivered in certain parameters and on time and budget and so forth. And we've set up 3 work streams to do this work within CAST, one focusing on education, one on tools and benchmarks, and one on the advocacy work, which is obviously one of the major exercises. Now, I've got quite a bit of content here, quite detailed. I'm not expecting anybody to read it. I'm going to skim across the top just to give a sense that we really do have a plan. And And the detail of that is really what's ultimately important, but not for today. So those 3 work streams I just mentioned, and this is the kind of detail we've taken that to, and those in the architectural fraternity will recognise this as something that looks like a project plan for a project. We have a series of tasks, start dates, completion dates. Ultimately, you put a resource plan on this, of course, in terms of how to deliver it. But it's a series of actions that takes us along a journey to that 2030 target. And each step is a relatively simple one. Each task is a relatively clearly defined. Once you break down to simple tasks, then it's much easier to think about how you approach those tasks and really treat it as a clearly defined campaign. Now, this one I wanted to extract because this is the sort of the urgent work of CAST that is focusing on in this next period. We need to get an Australian standard written to become the focus point for all of those involved, all the stakeholders in the construction industry to be pointing to. The local government authorities, the approvals people point to this target of this standard, and we can all be getting around a common platform and moving forward and avoiding the risk, which I think is currently apparent, that we all might go off in a very disaggregated way, which would be then very hard to be sure of what the outcome would be. So we get that that standard in place in June 2022, and then we start the work of working around the codes and the certifiers and state and federal government departments who need to be involved to get on side, and the local government councils who ultimately approve building applications, and reach a point by the end of 2025, we have the standard in place as a mandatory framework. And then we've got 5 years from then to 2030 to ensure that all work and projects that are delivered in that period achieve the 2030 target of being zero carbon. And then one of the fundamental aspects of that is advocacy. These things won't happen without a lot of people talking to each other in a very coordinated and clearly targeted way, and helping people along the way to understand what they can do to contribute to this journey. So advocacy is a really very, very important part of this plan. And National Council, to their credit, adopted this plan in November at their National Council meeting last year, and set us on the pathway of starting to implement it, which is no small task. I'm certainly not underestimating the magnitude of the challenge, but I think once you break down a complex challenge into small, definable, manageable tasks and get them enacted in the right sequence with the right resources to achieve it, with the right communication amongst all the stakeholders, it's certainly not beyond the realms of reality. And we have to approach it on the basis that this is a realistic aspiration, a realistic target, and that we have to be working together. Getting everybody working together, of course, is one of the big challenges, because there's lots and lots of good people all around the country doing great work, not necessarily in a particularly coordinated way. And of course, there are a lot of others who aren't yet on the pathway and aren't yet believers that a 2030 target is realistic. So since then, the AIA itself has become carbon neutral in its operations. That was done in very quick speed with the assistance of Jerry McLeod, one of my wonderful collaborators. And there's been a national campaign being rolled out, guiding practices around the country for themselves to become carbon neutral in their own operations. What's the term? Walking the walk, talking the talk. Obviously, architects need to show the leadership. If we can justify taking a position of leadership in this, we have to substantiate it through our own actions. And part of that is that, again, late last year, we got very heavily involved in a review of the National Competency Standards for the Practicing of Architecture, the NSCA, which guides the education and the registration of practicing architects. So a very important framework for determining how architecture is practiced. And these are very significant changes for the profession. It now requires that all education institutes that contribute to the training of architects to maintain their own certification providers for architectural training must themselves be teaching zero carbon design as a mandatory part of their programs. And indeed, and this is another big move forward, that the ongoing registration of architects must itself be contingent upon participating in certified zero carbon design training along the way. So this involves a very significant re-engineering of architectural practice in this country. It is a significant journey in itself, but we've really made a great step forward in this, and hopefully we can bring everybody along on that journey too. In addition, last year we put together some continuing professional development courses in zero carbon design as pilots to test and start the process of the training that needs to go into it. And as I mentioned earlier, we've now started the development of the process for the Australian Standard Framework, which will be the focus for all development approvals requiring ideally a whole of life carbon understanding of buildings, not just operational, but also embedded. And we see that the pathway to that 2030 is that the thresholds for approvals in terms of the carbon performance of buildings will be a bar that is raised incrementally during that period. We can't start in 25 expecting that things are already zero carbon. We have to understand that this is itself a journey and has all sorts of pragmatic considerations to helping the whole industry move along that journey, and we would see that as I say, the bars for approvals being raised steadily as we traverse that journey. And the CCAP report, this I've been talking to extracts of it, is forming the basis of a submission to the RIBA forum that's leading into COP26 later in the year. So to play our role, the AIA is currently recruiting resources to assist in this very important advocacy work. It's not to be underestimated the amount of work it takes to play our role to help move this along towards that 2030 target. So that's all from me today, and I'll close off there, and we'll move on to Deo Prasad.
Thank you so much, Ross. Well, now to next steps and practical action. The next presenter is Scientia Professor Deo Prasad, who is among the internationally recognised Australian experts in the field of environment and sustainability, with a focus on net zero carbon innovations. Deo has published over 300 peer-reviewed articles, including several books, and his experience covers practice as a consultant, thought leader, and a distinguished academic, as well as significant leadership and governance expertise, all with notable recognition from all levels of government and professions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. And my name is Deo Prasad. I'm a professor at UNSW. And we've been working with the Institute of Architects team, the CAST group. Ross has presented the CAST agenda, and I will go on and describe some parts of it which go in a bit more detail, looking at how do we navigate towards low carbon in a more effective way, in knowing Australian climate, Australian practices, and so forth. So we all know that we are addressing a broader set of issues in design, sustainability goals, which is much more extensive. The case for carbon reduction has been made quite clearly by earlier speakers, but by many reports internationally. So I will not go into that, but just to say that we are now focusing much more on climate emergency, how quickly we can navigate the building sector down towards net zero carbon. A lot of material is available. The CRC for low carbon living over the years has produced lots of guides to low carbon precinct design, planning, buildings, retrofits, and these are all available freely on the CRC website if you Googled it. In addition to that, there's also a lot of work internationally that's being done that you are all aware of, and Ed and Ross would have alluded to them, from Global Alliance for Building and Construction to World Green Building Council, Royal Institute of British Architects, LETI, and the American Institute of Architects. A lot of work's being done, and there is a lot of precedence to pick up upon. In Australia, the Australian government has set itself a target of 26 to 28% reduction compared to 2005 levels. These are slightly old targets and not much has been done more recently, but each state and territory has its own aspirations about carbon reduction, which you can see range from 50% renewables by 2030 to much more intensive and detailed approaches by some of the state and territory governments. A number of organizations, the neighbors, the Green Building Council, the Construction Code, these have all also produced documents. So for you as practitioners in architecture, there is a lot of available information, even down to City of Sydney, City of Melbourne, and Beyond Zero, and among others, have produced a lot of information. So there is no lack of guidance in how do we navigate towards net zero. In this research that we have been conducting, we are looking at on a more holistic approach, a whole of life carbon approach, where we look at both operational carbon and embedded carbon, because we need to tackle both to bring the building sector down to net zero, as has been said earlier. In this, we are trying to start with the early stages, as you see in the diagram, product stage, construction stage, use stage, and end of life stage. Beyond life, we are not looking at it here because we're trying to get people on board, especially on embodied carbon, to become good practitioners in this area rather than simply complicated by too much data and tool that becomes difficult to navigate. The strategies for net zero are very clear, as you see. What we in designing and building, we create emissions by services we provide, by materials we pick, and we can. That goal is to reduce it to not only offset that, but more than that, so that we can actually move towards a better climate and other future. So in trying to navigate that, very different partners have different approaches. My university has looked at a solar farm, for example, to offset all its energy use using photovoltaics. And as you see, we have in the diagram below, the daytime use offsets the base load at night. And the building you see here is where about more than 50% of world IP in photovoltaics that's on the roofs at the moment came from. Just look up father of photovoltaics, Professor Martin Green, and you will see what he has achieved in that sense. So in developing methodologies for Australia, we looked at the top-down method, the Paris-proof method, and the bottom-up approach, which is looking at all the data and tools we have available and models, and come to a gap which is between current best practice and the energy budget, so that we can target a energy utilization range which would be practical given how we build and how we design buildings. So these information in detail will be available for within 10 minutes. I have to fit just the outline of these. In commercial buildings, class 5, as we know, we have data, average COEC data, 138 kilowatt hours per meter squared per annum. But Neighbours has tried to improve that for class 5 to 110. And we think it can be done at 66 to 72 range without too much problem now. So there's a lot of room to improve at the moment if we are committed to doing it. In terms of targets and pathways, COEG again has current average performance of building on the blue there on the left, and then best practice of Neighbours. We are trying to improve on that from a science-based approach, target performance, and navigate to zero. And it is much easier going from a really good practice, best practice, towards net zero, using on-site and offset through renewable energy. So there's a lot of opportunities there, even on embodied energy. The COEG data shows that in the order of 3,937 is the kilogram of carbon equivalent per meter squared net lettable area at the moment in the stock. But by 2025, using percent reductions on the graph, as you see, we can reduce it to 2,362 by 2025 in the building stock. 2030, we will reach, go much further down, and 2040 for clearly achievable for net zero. However, for many and most of the buildings, you could do it much sooner and before 2030. And only the ones that you can't drag on to 2040. So this is possible, and renewable energy offsets, there are issues to do with trying to offset using renewables when you can do more on site. However, the different clientele systems that exist may wish to navigate that way and use renewable energy in a big way so that it's in the grid largely, and as a result it makes it easier for us to navigate that. So when you look at the challenges we pose, we have set up a track, and by 2021 we can, which is now, start on this challenge. 2025 we have a significant achievement in having the tools and data sets and everything right, and standards, and then by 2030 we can certainly deliver an operational net zero for the building stock, and for many of the buildings embodied carbon as well. But by 2040 we should get the other ones into the mix, and we can deliver net zero buildings by 2040 in Australia, given our climates and all the different what you call types of buildings and locations, and how we build across the range. So thank you. All of this information is going to be put into a guide, and the guide will be available widely and freely through the CAST group's work, and we hope we can help you navigate to net zero embodied and operational carbon quite effectively. There is the need for a good conversation between the client and the architect, just to make sure you have common agreement on when and how, because there are costs involved and you would need that discussion. It's like a commitment agreement that Neighbours has, but in this case these are much more one-on-one conversation with clients that might lead to an agreement on how we navigate over what time you want to go net zero. And these would be essential pieces of going through the design process and delivering. A book on the same subject, which will be much larger, more than 250 pages, as they say, for deeper reading, would be available by December, and Springer is bringing that out much later in the year. But the guide is produced locally and it will be freely available. So all the best. We think we can do net zero buildings by 2030 in most cases. Where they go astray, we can do it certainly by 2035 to 2040. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Deo. And now to pick up on some of the issues raised in the keynote presentations, it's my pleasure to hand back to Professor Helen Lochhead, CAST Chair, in conversation with the keynote presenters. Helen, over to you.
Thanks, Viv, and thanks to all our presenters. They were fantastic presentations, so I really look forward to talking to you a little bit more about them. So, Ed, I was wondering, is it possible for you to start off and provide an international perspective? You highlighted in your talk the carbon budget of 1.5 degrees in your presentation, and the need to phase out the building sector emissions by 2040. So why are we still hearing about 2050 as the point of time when we're going to phase this out? And in real terms, what's the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees from your perspective?
Well, you know, first, it was in Paris when in 2015 when we put forward the 2050 date, because at that time, that's when we needed to phase out all emissions with intermediate steps. So the 2050 date kind of was enshrined in Paris in 2015. But since that time, we've obviously haven't reduced emissions globally. And so we've used up quite a bit of that carbon budget. But the 2050 date, many NGOs and governments have kind of committed to that. And because they have huge constituencies, the 2050 date kind of took on a life of its own. But we now know that we have to get there much faster. And we need that 50% reduction by 2030. So right now we want to focus on the 2030 date, because if we get to the 50% reduction by 2030, I have no doubt we'll phase out by 2040, just because of the inertia of getting to that 2030 date. Now, the difference between the 1.5 and the 2, that's a half a degree Celsius, there's some interesting projections from the scientific community of what that difference means. Let me just go over a few of them. If we go from 1.5 to 2, just that half a degree, the scientific community is projecting that 1 to 2 billion more people will no longer have adequate water, and that 1.7 billion more people will be exposed to severe heat waves every 5 years. Let me put that in context. The entire Western Hemisphere, the population of North America and South America, the United States, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Peru, Venezuela, the population of that entire Western Hemisphere is 1 billion people. So we're talking about a huge number of people being affected between the 1.5 and the 2. It's really incumbent upon it possible to do that, because the difference is huge.
Thank you. I might just now pass to Ross, because in your talk, you talked about the IPCC graph in your presentation, which shows various scenarios. And so we've got 2040 as the end state, but we've actually nominated 2030 as our goal. So do you think we can get there? And why do you think that's going to be possible?
Well, thanks, Helen. The graph is an interesting kind of, the IPCC graph is an interesting reference point for me, because it really, and here we are, we've got it. It really illustrates that we have, these things are choices. We've got our choice. This is in our control to decide what trajectory we take. And you can see where the point of inflection is. It's around about 2030. And building on the points that Ed just made, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees really hinges around this point, because what are we now? Something like 1.2, I think. And people like Will Steffen and Johan Rottstrom, as I mentioned earlier, at the Potsdam Institute, and the sort of stuff they've been publishing, talk about a hothouse effect. And in the German, it's a very dramatic, it's Heißzeit, which literally means hot house, Earth. And they believe that at 2 degrees, the risk is, so adding to Ed's point, the 2 degrees is a tipping point where we could shift from the Earth's current self-cooling mechanism to a self-heating mechanism, as in hothouse. And it's interesting, the awareness that there is in Europe to this issue compared with Australia. Heißzeit was the most quoted word in Germany in 2018 when they released that report. So the consciousness, in a place like Germany is much greater. So, if we don't make that change that Ed's talking about between, keeping it down 0.5, and we've only got 0.3 of a degree to go to get there, we could risk meeting that tipping point. And if we get really onto the case by 2030 and so forth, then we get a chance on the blue trajectory to actually start healing things, to start bringing the temperature down by 2000 and by 2100. But that high range there, the very high, getting up to 5 degrees, which is technically achievable on our current trajectory by the end of, if we don't make any changes, means that the sea rise could start a process that's not reversible, the melting of the ice, that at some time in the future, and I don't think anybody's put an actual timeline on this, but the temperature rise of 5 to 8 would mean a sea rise of 10 to 60 meters. the last time there was an increase of 5 degrees was the end of the last great ice age, when the sea water level rose by 120 meters, when 2/3 of the ice on the Earth melted. And the third that's still there, if that melts, that's when it'll go up 60 degrees. And I live in Western Australia, and the whole of the coast of Perth would be flooded because the foothills of the escarpment are at 50 metres. So we just can't contemplate that, and we've got a great opportunity to get down to keeping to 1.5, lowering the temperature back to 1.3 by the end of the century, and start healing things. And I think the trajectory is achievable once you focus on it. And I think there's been plenty said today about how to get there.
Yeah. So essentially, if we hit it hard now, we can really make a positive difference. The longer we leave it, the more difficult it's going to become. So Daya, that's why we need to. It's a good segue. Yeah. So Daya, that's a good segue, because in fact, what you've done is you've tried to untangle this, plethora of targets, guides, and tools that many don't know where to start from, and actually reduce it to first principles, analyze it, look at the empirical evidence, and put together not only a very technical guide for an academic audience, but a very simple guide for practitioners who really want to come on this journey. And so we'll be welcoming that in October. But you show that it's possible to get to net zero buildings in Australia by 2030, which is good to know for both operational carbon and maybe slower for embodied carbon. This sounds really good, but what's needed to happen to get there?
Thank you, Helen. Thanks, Helen. As I showed, we are beginning to take a whole of life approach, and we need to, because there is carbon across the life of the building. And at the same time, we have split them into operational carbon and embedded carbon. So operational carbon, it is possible, not too difficult to show that we can drive by 2030. The cost of renewable energy is coming down so much. And as I said earlier, the UNSW example, the decision was made on the basis of cost and not just environmental benefits, but it was the cheapest option using a 15-year power purchase agreement, and hence it was quite obvious that we should do that. But in terms of embodied carbon, the advancements in new materials and technology, especially for high-rise type buildings, means the average in the marketplace at the moment in terms of embedded carbon is very high. And we need to bring it down all to best practice. Architects are the key people here. I think to bring both the operational and embedded to the best practice now would give us till 2030 to be able to drive it down using on-site generation as well as renewable energy offsets to drive it down to 2030 being zero. And as I said, a key part of that conversation between architects and clients, you need to discuss it up front, have a plan, show the best performance you can achieve, and then look at how you're going to offset over a period of time. And this is beginning to happen. Many of the leading architects are beginning to do that. It needs more than that. It needs governments to come on board. It needs the building code to come on board and have a trajectory that is inclusive of all these measures, efficiencies, good design encouragement, on-site generation incentives, and off-site. The grid has to go greener faster. In the last 10 years, we have gone from 10% to about 25% on average in terms of renewable energy content. And by 2030, if we are there, as some predict, in excess of 50% renewable energy in the grid in Australia across the board, then we are making huge advancements there. And the reason for saying that the embodied might lag a bit is because it will rely heavily on offset, especially for existing buildings. So thank you.
Great. I know, well, both Ross and Ed also touched on the importance of regulation and codes. And Ed, in your talk, you mentioned zero carbon building codes. Can you tell us where else in the world zero carbon building codes are becoming the norm? I mean, you cited Sydney as a great local leader, but where are the places that are the real exemplars that we should be looking to?
Sure. Yeah, we designed the Zero Code, which is a zero carbon code standard, which is, again, no on-site fossil fuels, electrification, and renewables to power the building. We designed that as an international standard. It is now part of the International Energy Conservation Code as an appendix, so it could be adopted with any International Energy Conservation Code year. So if you adopt the appendix, then you would have a zero code. We were in China and presented the zero code, I think about 2 years ago. And within 12 months, the Chinese developed a zero code. So they have a nearly zero energy building code standard with on-site and off-site renewables. The key now is to get local governments to adopt it. So that's been done. The EU has a mandate, and all countries are expected to have essentially a zero carbon code standard in place this year. So some countries are on track, other countries are still in the development stage, but essentially it's a nearly zero energy building with on-site and then off-site, nearby off-site renewable energy, and that's for all EU countries. That's a directive. We're seeing Boston getting ready to adopt zero code. The state of Oregon has adopted the zero code, the ASHRAE 90.1 2019 as the standard now, and then reporting on the on-site and off-site. It's up to the cities now to put the renewables in place. And we're seeing over 50 cities now in California, and the AIA California has put in the zero code for the next upgrade in California's Title 24, but many cities are now employing no on-site fossil fuels, electrification, and then going to renewables. There are 50 no on-site fossil fuel electrification, either code standards or legislation on the books now in California. So it's now beginning to really gain traction. And as we begin to see and experience the impacts of climate change, the code standards, I think, will move out very, very quickly.
So there's a whole lot of elements that are critical. How critical are the building codes? I mean, you talked about carrots and sticks, or incentives, for the big users and the big emitters, and how successful that was. But we also need regulation. But what sort of criticality, I mean, for our membership to understand the role of codes in helping them to get to where we need to be, as you see it, or from your experience?
I was in just to give you an example of why it's important to have a zero code in place. I was in Chicago and I was talking to the AIA Chicago. So we had all the firms there, and we were talking about the zero code. And I was talking about Chicago, adopting a zero code, and the architect said, "You mean if Chicago adopts a zero code, then I don't have to deal with zero carbon and kind of convince clients and do all this stuff. I automatically have to do it because no one questions the code." So once the code becomes the norm, we will see things move very, very quickly because essentially everyone has to abide by it. And so it all of a sudden becomes the norm and the standard. So it's important to get it in place really quickly.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good point for our members to realize that in fact regulation can be their friend, because it is often the very hard conversation to have with clients. But when you, as you say, you're required to do it. Now, Ross, we've made it a real focus of our task group, and then obviously necessary to transform the sector. But surely there are only minimums. As architects know. So how do we show leadership beyond the code? And what do you see as the key steps?
Well, I think Ed touched on a really good point about once the code's in place, there's no argument, no discussion, and I think that's one of the reasons why we have to have an element of top down as well as bottom up to this process. And as I touched on earlier, and I think you've just alluded to, putting in place the framework is really important. But one of the challenges is that when it comes to embodied carbon, there are lots of different ways of measuring it. Once one gets immersed in this world and starts investigating, you see that there's lots of variance of opinion around the world, and indeed even within Australia, about how to measure carbon. So that's why I think we at CAST in the next step are focusing on the development of the standard, because we have to standardize the way of measuring carbon to overcome the problem or the risk of it being measured in different ways in different local codes and guidelines. I mean, we've got lots of terrific work being done in Australia on all sorts of fronts in this area. And one of the really interesting ones that came out recently is 26 local government authorities in Western Melbourne have come up with their own scorecard, BESS, Built Environment Sustainability Scorecard, which is a wonderful initiative. But the risk is that if we have different local government authorities with different standards and different ways of measuring, then we risk disadvantaging certain developers in certain jurisdictions by their buildings being measured in different ways. So we have to standardize the way of measuring carbon. And then once we've got that Australian standard, probably going to be an adaptation of a European standard where it's much more advanced, I suspect, maybe American. Then we can get all of the National Construction Code, the local government authorities and local planning schemes all point to the same place as a reference point. That this is how we are all going to be measuring carbon. And then we can let the fronts move on and get to those targets. So that's why that framework has to be in place within the next 3 or 4 years.
Great, thank you. I think it's really important to explain what all the componentry does and why each and every part of it is important to the end goal. Daya, do you have anything else to add about embodied carbon? I mean, or do you think Ross has said it all? The difficulty is really the differences in how we actually measure it and how we actually, or is it deeper than that?
I think Ross has made a very good point there, that we have to have consistent approaches in terms of measurement. There are a number of key methodologies in assessment of where the boundaries are and how do you, whether you look at just the upfront or the whole of life in terms of recurring embodied carbon and all that. They have to, because tools have evolved with different assumptions, it's been a bit difficult aligning them to a single course. So that is happening. I must say there is the MECLA group nationally, among others, who are driving this. So we are moving in the same direction. ASPEC, the peak body, industry body, is helping navigate this much faster than we would have otherwise done. So that's all good. But our mindset about building codes, just referring to the earlier point by Ed and Ross both, that we have to move from eliminating worst practice to heading towards best practice. And that's where we have to have stringencies that help drive zero carbon much more carefully. But in a policy sense, as a segue into the next conversations, I guess, there have to be, the building code is a key part of commitments that have to be made, but also how rapidly and effectively we can green the grid, letting more renewable energy, encouraging that, because that brings investment into the country in terms of renewable energy, and how quickly can we have more renewable energy in the grid, so that then that deals with a whole bunch of other problems. Because if you're getting largely green power from grid, then it helps our navigation into net zero by 2030 much easier.
Thank you, Deo. Actually, I might just throw back to you, Ed. I mean, when we talk about embodied carbon and operational carbon, you talked about the US building sector over the last 15 years, adding, you know, 5 to 6 billion square meters of building stock. But there must have been a huge impact on existing building stock as well as new building stock. And how did this happen? And what were the key levers that were really kind of moved to actually shift this output?
Yeah, in 2003, we discovered that the building sector was a major component of greenhouse gas emissions. And we started to bring that to the attention of our building sector and our professional organizations. In 2005, when we saw the switch happen, where building construction was going up, energy consumption was going up, emissions was going up. In 2005, we issued the 2030 challenge to our profession, and it was immediately adopted by almost every professional organization, including the 95,000 member American Institute of Architects. And what we called for was a 50% reduction in building operations if you were designing a new building. And if you were renovating, renovate down to about that 50% mark, so you bring energy consumption down. It wasn't a huge lift, but what we knew was that in the US, we renovate slightly more square footage than we build new. So we build new a huge amount, and then we renovate a huge amount and a little more. So by doing the 50%, 50-50, we thought we could then level out energy consumption. It wouldn't keep going up. And that's exactly what happened. And then what we did is every 5 years, we increased the reduction. So it went from 50% to 60% to 70%. Right now it's at 80%, but we're moving that timeline up, and we're saying get to zero now, because we know now we can do it. We have the codes in place. We know that the standards that are in play, and we can easily do that. And we have now firms who have signed on to the communique that are now committing to zero carbon design as we speak. Once the major firms do it, that are responsible for lots of building floor area, then it works its way down through our entire community.
So we're almost at the end of our time, but I was just wondering whether, I mean, Ed, perhaps you, or any of the speakers that we've heard from today have a key takeaway for our audience that really kind of activates their imagination, but also their action.
Just
we can do
quickly,
it.
yes, we can, and we should. So we're calling on the architecture community worldwide now to design to zero carbon. They can design, obviously, we have so many strategies. I mean, everything from building form, where you put glass, shading, natural ventilation, you name it. We can design to zero, to very, very efficient buildings, and then use renewables now. So we're calling on our profession and our professional colleagues to start doing that right now.
Great. Actually, I've been told to wrap up, so I'm going to have to move on now. And so I thank you very much for all your inputs. The presentations were great, and there's plenty of food for thought for everyone in the audience today. So thank you all, and thank you, Ed, for the international perspective.
Yes.
And now on to our next session.
Thank you. Nice.
And thank you so much, Helen, and to all of our panellists, and in particular, Ed. I know the time difference is not particularly kind with New Mexico at the moment. And Helen, you might want to take a quick 30-second break before we move into our next panel. Let's roll the opening animation.
As we know, carbon dioxide needs to reduce by 50 to 60% in the next decade to achieve the Paris Agreement target, a 1.5 degree rise in temperature compared to pre-industrial levels. So before we open up the discussion, we're going to hear from each of our parliamentarians, and I'd like to ask each to make a brief statement on what needs to be done to meet this challenge, including their commitments and plans to reduce carbon emissions and get to net zero. So I was going to start with Chris Bowen, but he's not yet joined us. So I might just go straight to Zali. So Zali Steggall MP, you introduced the Climate Change Bill in November 2020 as a private member's bill that would set a net zero target by 2050 in law. And despite broad support from many sectors, including ours, the Energy and Environment Committee recommended it not be passed. Where to from here?
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for having me. And if I may also pay my respects to Indigenous elders past, present and emerging, because we all have a responsibility to acknowledge our history but also work together for a safer and better future. Yes, climate change and the climate bills is very much a key focus for me, that we need to bring some sensible policies to this Parliament and try and stop the political football that we have in Australia around climate change policy and actually embrace a good framework. So the climate bills were a framework legislation to lock in into law net zero by 2050. But of course, I know the science is telling us we probably need to get there sooner. But what the mechanism allows for is 5-year emission reduction budgets, which can be ratcheted up, and essentially so that we have that line in the sand that it cannot go beyond 2050, but we have that visibility moving forward. Very important. Although the Environment and Energy Committee did not recommend debating the bills, that was the coalition members of that committee who just towed the party line. The opposition, Labor, supported that the bills be debated and supported the principles of the bill. And so it's really important that we have that debate. The bills will be reintroduced into Parliament at our next sitting, because I believe as we have a few weeks to go before COP26, this is a solution that's on the table. It's been workshopped, it's been collaboratively worked on. We've had submissions from every sector, including the Australian Institute of Architects. Thank you very much for your submission, which was a very, very good in establishing how important this sector is for your industry and your sector, and how beneficial it would be to have clear locked-in policy for a sector like in architects, in built environment, to know what you need to plan for, far ahead of time, and get rid of this short-term policy situation. So the bills will be reintroduced. They will introduce some slightly tighter duties on the Minister. They take on board some of the recommendations for amendments that were made, including, for example, that plans be disallowable instruments. And they will introduce an interim target for 2031, because obviously with the release of the IPCC report, this next decade is vital for us to make much bigger gains in emissions reduction.
Well, that's really good to hear. I am really pleased to hear that, and I know that we'll continue to support that bill. So now I'd like to hear from Green Senator Marine Faruqi. Welcome, Marine. Greens clearly state the Australian climate policy must be consistent with the Paris Agreement commitment. So how did the Greens propose to achieve this carbon reduction in your policy platform?
Yeah, hi, hello, Helen and Zali and everyone else. It's lovely to be here with you. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I am on, and I'm on Gadigal land in Sydney, and pay my respects to elders past and present. This land is, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. So thank you so much for having me, and it was really lovely to see Deo in the last session. Deo and I used to be colleagues in another life when I was an academic at UNSW. So you've probably already talked quite a bit today about the problem, but I know that more and more people in the community also want strong action on climate change. We just had Australia's biggest climate poll taken recently, and the results were pretty unequivocal. You know, voters in every single seat in this country, in regions and in cities, want more renewable energy. They don't want a senseless gas-led recovery. They are telling us to keep the coal in the hole and the gas and the oil in the soil. And, you know, climate science clearly tells us to stop putting pollution in the air. The United Nations has declared a code red for humanity. We must heed these warnings and demands before it's too late. So the Greens are listening to the scientists, we're listening to the experts, and we're listening to the community, as we've always done. We don't have the luxury, frankly, to wait till 2050. It's going to be too late. We know that this decade is the defining decade. Have this window of opportunity, which we should grab with both hands. And Australia can be and should be leading the world on climate action, not hampering it. So for the Greens, we really want net zero emissions by 2035 and a 75% cut by 2030, which is consistent with the science, and it's consistent with the Independent Climate Targets Panel. We know that we cannot deal with climate change without dealing with coal and gas. And for that, we must phase out coal power stations and exports by 2030, and also legislate against new coal mines and gas fields. I mean, it is absolutely criminal that when we have all this information, it is absolute ecocide to give the green light to fracking the Beetaloo Basin for gas in the Northern Territory. But as we phase out oil and gas and move towards 100% renewable energy, and for us that target should also be 2030, we must have a just transition for workers in these sectors and an investment in local coal and gas communities so that they can attract the jobs and the new industries that they want, that they can retain and upskill to ensure that these local communities can continue to thrive. And that is a core part of our plan. There are also real opportunities here. Why we shouldn't be looking at this move as a constraint. There's a real opportunity here to build a clean green economy. And, you know, we can have a multi-billion-dollar clean energy export industry to replace coal exports. And particularly with respect to the built environment, I think a national system of energy efficiency targets and stringent minimum energy performance standards in accordance with the world's best practice for products, buildings, and infrastructure, I think has to be part and parcel of the program. As the Green spokesperson for housing, our plan to address the housing crisis at the moment, which is across Australia, is to build 1 million public and community homes over the next 2 decades. And they should be built in a climate conscious way with the highest standards of sustainability and environmental accountability and accessibility. And we can build, as I was hearing in the other conversation, we can build carbon zero buildings and the governments, both state and local, must be supported to encourage reuse and recycling of building materials. And the last thing I want to say is that if Australia is to be truly a leader on climate action, then we have to put our own house in order and use our influence to push for action across the globe. It is our obligation to support and provide international aid to the global south, and in particular, our Pacific neighbors, who are suffering some of the worst and first impacts of the climate crisis, which they had no part in creating. And that means increasing significantly our contributions to climate finance, the Green Climate Fund, and providing climate reparations. It's been clear for a while that we know what we need to do to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The only thing lacking now is the political will. And it's up to all of us to make sure that that pressure to change the political will happens.
Great. Thank you, Maureen. Now, I believe Chris Bowen has joined us. Chris, great. Thank you for joining us and welcome. I'm not sure whether you had the opportunity to hear Maureen's words of commitment from the Greens, but I guess I'd like to actually put the pressure on you and say, you've spoken extensively about that net zero emissions by 2050 is not necessarily sufficient, and I imagine, are being more ambitious. So you've spoken about a strong roadmap. What is it? Can you tell us how you would plan to get there if you had the reins?
Thanks. And just before I do that, let me just mention to you that I'm talking to you from my home, which is the land of the Gadigal people, the Darug Nation, and pay my respects to their elders and to the elders of all the lands of which we gather today. So, yeah, you're right. I regard net zero by 2050 as the absolutely essential bare minimum of a framework of a climate policy. And it's remarkable that we are still having this debate in Australia in 2021 about whether we would commit to net zero by 2050. It should be the agreed framework of bipartisanship at the very least. It is in every other developed country that is the bare minimum. Some people say 2050 is too late, and it is too late if it's all you do. If you simply think that just getting to net zero emissions by 2050 is enough, if we started theoretically, say, in 2048, which wouldn't be technically feasible, but even if it was theoretically feasible, it wouldn't be enough. What really counts is the total conglomeration of emissions between now and 2050, with net zero as the sort of framework, the goal. Unless you have the goal, then you're not going to have the roadmap to get there. Unless you know the end point, you're not going to have the strong framework to get there. So we do need a strong framework. I've been very clear that the government should be committing to much more ambitious targets at COP at Glasgow than the 26 to 28% current national target, which is, after all, the target given to the country by Tony Abbott, who, with all due respect to him as a former Prime Minister, is a climate change denier. So it doesn't really provide that investment framework that we have. Now, unfortunately, I won't be representing Australia in Glasgow at the COP. I would like to be as Climate Change Minister, but I won't be because we have no role to play. But I made it very clear that the government should be embracing stronger medium-term targets. And, of course, if they don't, then I'll be outlining a strong roadmap towards 2050 as the alternative government at an appropriate time, including how we would get there. The government says, you can't have a target without the policies underpinning it. Well, that's true, but they use it as an alibi to not have the target. I say it's absolutely essential to have both. So we'll be outlining the roadmap to 2050. We'll also be outlining policies to get there. No doubt we'll talk about some of those maybe later on this session, and we'll be doing that sector by sector. And we've already started, with our community batteries policy, with our various policies in relation to rewiring the nation, which is very important because there's no transition to a renewable economy without a massive upgrade to transmission. We need to massively upgrade the grid. We've started to announce our electric vehicle policy to cut the price of electric vehicles by cutting the taxes on electric cars. And there's much, much more to come. And we'll be outlining those in a very methodical way between now and the next election. But really, net zero is the fundamental, essential starting point. To conclude, I've outlined 4 principles which will underpin our commitment to net zero. One is, as you indicated, that it's essential but not enough, not sufficient. 2, that good that policies need to underpin it, and that those policies will be sectorally based. 3, that jobs policy has to be the centre of climate change action. Good climate change policy is good jobs policy. The world's climate emergency is Australia's jobs opportunity in our very strong view, and that's got to be reflected in the policy approach, as it is, for example, with our policy of 10,000 new energy apprentices that we've already announced. And 3rd, that the regions have to be at the centre, not just because those regions will be undergoing massive economic change as a result of the world's decarbonisation, but also because they are the areas which will power us under a renewable economy. The same areas which have powered us with traditional energy generation, with coal generation, are the areas with the space for big renewable installations, with the access to the transmission grid. It's why, for example, most of the offshore wind proposals are off the coal coasts of Australia, because that's where they can feed into the grid. That's a win-win, because there'll be lots of jobs created. That's just one example. The areas with the access to the pipelines, the grid, and the ports for exports, importantly. I believe we can continue to be a massive exporter of energy. It'll just be more and more renewable energy. We've seen great news this week, for example, with the expansion of the Sun Cable proposal, which is a massive solar farm in the Northern Territory with 24 million solar panels, which will feed in through a submarine pipe through Indonesia, the waters of Indonesia, to Singapore, to help power Singapore, as so many countries in our regions will struggle to get the renewable energy generation capacity because there's space constraints and other constraints. We can export renewable energy, and that'll be an important part of the framework. So, as I said, we've started to outline those policies. There's many, many more to come, but the essential framework, which is really an investment framework to give investors the confidence they need to invest in renewable energy, is net zero by 2050. It's just the bare minimum essential starting point.
Thanks, Chris. I might just bring in Vincent and Caroline Pidcock. Vincent Martinez from Architecture 2030 and Caroline from Architects Declare, and also our CAST Taskforce. So listening to these responses, where do you see architects in what we've heard so far, and more broadly, the built environment sector? I'm just searching for some direction for our politicians to take us on board and be part of the story. We heard a little bit from Maureen in this regard, but maybe starting from you, Caroline. Oh, we can't hear you. I don't think we're hearing you, Caroline. Oh. Well, maybe while you're sorting out your microphone, Caroline, I'll flip to Vincent. Vincent, yeah, from your absolutely. Perspective, you can provide an international perspective and really launch into how governments have actually helped in your part of the world in sectoral growth.
And we track policy around the world. I'd like to start just like the elected officials have started, by recognizing that I'm based in Seattle, Washington area in the United States, home of the traditional lands of the Duwamish tribe and people and stewards of this land. So I want to recognize where I'm based as well in the world and the indigenous cultures. Now, I'd say that what we're tracking and some of the insights that I've taken from the members of parliament that have been presented is really around this concept of frameworks and roadmaps and target setting, policies to support, and then transitional economies. And what's really interesting that we're seeing is we talk about policies here in the United States and other regions in Europe that have TLC, not targeted, they're targeted policies that have longevity and consistency. And so those are what allow a transition to occur, is if we understand the incremental steps, just like Ross talked about in terms of the practice perspective. The same thing applies to policy. They provide confidence in transitioning these markets. So I think the members of parliament are absolutely right on the money in terms of talking about these steps incrementally, but also setting that long-term goal and understanding that businesses will transition. Now, what's interesting about the direction that we hear is the job creation typically has been focused around renewable energy generation. Certainly, we've heard the statistics about the reduction in costs of those systems, about the transition from dirtier fuels, more carbon emitting fuels into the cleaner revolution. But what we're also missing is that the built environment is responsible for the majority of the electricity consumption. And so we need to move away from the on-site fossil fuels that we heard earlier in the presentation around gas use, heating oil use, and transition those systems into electric systems to take advantage of the clean grid and set those policies. But we also need to upgrade all of our entire building stock over time. And that transition takes time. And so what we're creating in the same process is the same level of consistency and planning of job creation for the built environment. So architects play a critical role in this factor, because if for many of the renovations that are required, we need to look at the buildings holistically. We need to look at the facades, about the envelope. That will reduce the need for higher impact equipment. And so if we're going to take advantage of the clean grid, we need to have systems in our buildings that are efficient and are electric in order to move that forward. And so we're really talking about a transitional job creator of the built environment as we move forward to transition all of our building stock to zero carbon.
Great, thanks so much, Vincent. And Caroline, we've got you back online.
I think so.
Great.
Yep.
Okay, so we've got the international perspective. How about from an Australian perspective? What do you think about what has been said so far and how it impacts our sector? Or where do architects need to intersect with government's policy?
Firstly, I'm calling in from Gadigal land, so I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Gosh, we've got a lot to learn from their wisdom. But architects and what we can do right now, I mean, I think there's so much I can say here, but right now we've got a building code revision underway, and what is currently being proposed is totally inadequate. I'm in awe and jealous of what they've been able to achieve elsewhere around the world, and what's being proposed is not enough. And indeed, a number of the industry groups are lobbying to have no increase or no improvement, which is ridiculous considering 144,000 dwellings a year get built, and the current proposal is to reduce that from average of 7 tonnes per year down to 5 tonnes, and we can build them for no tonnes and do it now. So I think that, and I'd love to know, I mean, the Building Codes Board is not run by anyone, but we are going to be lobbying to set a net zero carbon emissions target. And I think that that's kind of important, because we've got to start talking about carbon, not energy, and we've got to be giving a way, and then we can get to that any way people want, as long as it's net zero carbon, which means that different states, different territories, different climates can get there in different ways, and it allows for the creativity and ingenuity of the industry to create really clever ways of doing it. Because I think that regulations can be very constrictive and not good, but if you're just setting a really good target to meet, then we should be doing it. And I think that 2050 is certainly so not enough. 2030 or 2031 is a date that we absolutely have to be setting for emissions. You know, I mean, if this was an Olympic Games, Zali, we'd be coming last and the Australians would be really unhappy, and you wouldn't be saying, oh, well, the Olympics aren't for sort of 8, 10, 12, whatever years, we'll start practicing later. I mean, everyone puts their effort in and goes for it now, and I think that's exactly what we should be doing. And I have the confidence in our industry that we are already meeting that target, but we can rise and do even more creative and wonderful things if we're given the opportunity and given the backing of regulation, which brings along the worst performing members of the industry. It gives confidence to manufacturers and building supply people to reconfigure and build. And it has to happen now. And there is an opportunity right now for that to change. And I am looking for support in doing that. And we'll be looking for all architects to be writing in, and other industry people in the very near future, to the Australian Building Codes Board to demand a better outcome than just 7 stars.
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline. So that's a very simple low-hanging fruit for our parliamentarians to listen to. We have regulation, we've also got incentives. You know, that there's the carrots and sticks approach, but you can see that something as simple as the National Construction Code is something very close to our heart. So what about from your perspective, Maureen? Do you think that some sectors like the built environment can get to carbon zero more quickly than others and before 2050? I mean, you've talked about some of the things that you'd like to see, like products, energy efficient standards, phasing out of fossil fuels, and those 1 million homes that you'd like to see put in place being truly sustainable. What more do you think there is possible?
Yeah, and thanks, Vincent and Caroline, both for highlighting, your perspectives on that as well. I mean, you are the experts, and we need to listen to you, frankly, on these issues. And I must say, I cannot overstate again the importance of coming as close to net zero as possible in the next decade. Like I said, we have a 75% target for 2030 and 100% for 2035. And it is wonderful to see that you've already started that work. And, I'm very impressed with the Institute setting up of the Climate Action and Sustainability Taskforce. And there is absolutely no doubt that there is a lot of low-hanging fruit in the built environment. And the built environment has a huge impact on our health and well-being generally as well. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really exposed some of the inadequacies and fault lines in how we've planned and built our cities and structures within. And there's a lesson to be learned there, the importance of having access to green spaces, for instance, and parks, no matter where we live, the good airflow in buildings and homes are just a couple of examples. I mean, I grew up in Pakistan, and in Pakistan, when people decided to think of building